Fall River, Massachusetts, in the early 1900s, was more than a booming mill town. It was a Portuguese kitchen come alive. Thousands of Azorean and Madeiran families came into the city lured by work. Overpopulation, poverty, and natural disasters back home pushed them out. Picture the streets, the clang of mill bells mixing with the scent of caldo verde simmering on wood stoves, the sweetness of malasadas frying in lard, and the smoky bite of chorizo filling narrow alleys. These weren't just meals, they were lifelines, and a few became icons that still define Fall River today. So, in this video, we're diving into 25 Portuguese foods that fed, comforted, and connected a community. By the end, you'll see how these humble meals didn't just feed families, they built an identity that still lingers a century later. 1. Bacalhau à gomes de sá. In the crowded kitchens of Fall River's Portuguese families, few meals carried the weight of tradition like bacalhau à gomes de sá. Salt cod was the immigrant's treasure, shipped across oceans, cheap, long-lasting, and ready to stretch across a big family table. Picture a cast-iron pan layered with tender potatoes, softened onions, hard-boiled eggs, and flakes of salted fish, revived after soaking overnight. Olive oil tied it all together, filling the house with a smell that was part comfort, part memory. For mill workers worn down by 12-hour shifts, this dish was survival and celebration rolled into one. It fed many mouths, traveled well in tin lunch pails, and reminded every diner of the Azores. And here's the kicker. Even today, Fall River's bakeries and restaurants still serve it almost unchanged. One bite is like stepping back to 1905, proof that some foods aren't just recipes, they're anchors of identity. 2. Caçoila. If bacalhau fed the body, caçoila fed the soul. This Azorean pork stew wasn't fast food, it was patience in a pot. Picture chunks of pork shoulder marinating overnight in red wine, garlic, paprika, and bay leaves, then slow-simmered until tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a spoon. The fragrance filled every tenement hallway in Fall River, turning humble apartments into little pieces of the Azores. For mill families, caçoila meant more than just dinner. It was a Sunday ritual, often cooked in clay pots, shared with neighbors, and eaten with thick slices of crusty bread that soaked up every drop of spicy, garlicky sauce. Even on lean weeks, a single pot stretched to feed everyone, proof that flavor didn't need fortune. And here's the kicker. Caçoila became a festival food too, showing up at feasts and Holy Ghost celebrations, linking immigrant families to faith, heritage, and home. 3. Bifanas. If there was a food that tasted like pure hustle in Fall River's Portuguese neighborhoods, it was the bifana. Imagine thin slices of pork marinated in garlic, white wine, and paprika, then quickly fried until juicy and tender. The meat was tucked into a crusty Portuguese roll, sometimes with a smear of mustard, sometimes just dripping with its own juices. Simple, fast, and cheap. The perfect meal for workers who didn't have hours to sit down. In the early 1900s, mill hands often grabbed bifanas from small taverns or street vendors. They were the blue-collar sandwich before America even thought of fast food. One roll filled you up, 2 rolls kept you going till dawn. And here's the kicker. What started as a quick worker's bite became a symbol of Portuguese pride. Even today, you'll find bifanas sizzling on grills during festivals, proof that sometimes the humblest meals leave the loudest mark. 4. Linguiça and chorizo sausage platter with fried potatoes. When you walked into a Portuguese kitchen in Fall River around 1910, chances are the first smell that hit you was smoke and spice from linguiça and chorizo. These sausages were more than food, they were survival art. Families mixed pork with garlic, paprika, and red wine, then smoked it to last through the week. Served alongside crispy fried potatoes, the platter was rich, filling, and perfect for hungry mill workers. Linguiça had a milder, garlicky bite, while chorizo carried a deeper, smoky punch. Put both on the table with potatoes fried in pork fat, and you had a feast fit for a king. even if the paycheck barely stretched past rent. Kids grew up chewing on sausage slices wrapped in bread, while fathers packed chunks into lunch tins for long shifts. Here's the kicker. These sausages never disappeared. 100 years later, fall river markets still hang strings of linguiça and chorizo just like their grandparents once did. 5. Seafood rice. Fall River sat right on the water, and for Portuguese families, the ocean was both memory and pantry. Arroz de marisco, seafood rice, brought the taste of the Azores and mainland Portugal straight into Milltown kitchens. Picture a big pot of rice simmering in a tomato and garlic broth, then loaded with clams, mussels, shrimp, and sometimes squid, depending on what the fishermen hauled in that morning. For immigrant families, this dish was special, often reserved for Sundays or celebrations. The beauty was in its flexibility. A handful of shellfish stretched across a pot of rice could feed a whole family and a neighbor or two. The aroma of the sea mixed with the warmth of saffron or paprika turned any cramped tenement into a banquet hall. Here's the kicker. Even in hard times, a pot of seafood rice felt like luxury. It wasn't just dinner. It was a reminder that the ocean and their homeland were never far away. 6. Sweet malasadas with sugar and orange zest. If savory dishes kept mill workers fueled, malasadas gave them joy. These golden, sugary fritters were the treat every kid in Fall River's Portuguese neighborhoods dreamed about. Picture dough enriched with eggs and butter, fried until puffed and crisp, then rolled in sugar still warm enough to stick to your fingers. A touch of orange zest gave each bite a sunny brightness that cut through the cold New England air. Malasadas weren't everyday food. They showed up at festivals, church gatherings, and family celebrations, especially around Lent, when frying dough was both tradition and indulgence. For kids who knew nothing but long days and crowded homes, a hot malasada was pure magic. And here's the kicker. The tradition never faded. Every Holy Ghost festival in Fall River still has lines wrapped around church tents, waiting for paper bags filled with malasadas. One bite, and you're tasting the exact sweetness immigrants clung to over a century ago. 7. Carne de porco à lentejana. Few dishes captured the bold spirit of Portuguese cooking like carne de porco à lentejana. Imagine tender cubes of pork marinated in garlic and wine, fried crisp on the outside, then simmered together with briny clams and golden fried potatoes. On one plate, land and sea came together. A taste of Portugal's coastal villages brought straight into Fall River's Milltown kitchens. For immigrant families, this dish wasn't an everyday meal. Pork was precious, clams had to be gathered or bought fresh, and olive oil wasn't cheap. But when it appeared, usually for Sunday gatherings or feast days, it turned the table into a celebration. Every bite carried contrast. The richness of pork, the salt of clams, the comfort of potatoes, reminding families of home across the Atlantic. Here's the kicker. Even today, restaurants in Fall River serve this dish proudly, proving that the flavors of struggle and celebration can live side by side for over 100 years.
8.
Polvo grelhado. In Fall River's Portuguese kitchens, nothing drew stares quite like a pot with a whole octopus inside. Polvo grelhado, grilled octopus, was a dish that turned heads and stirred memories of seaside villages back in the Azores. After being simmered until tender, the octopus was grilled over high heat, brushed with olive oil, and sprinkled with garlic and parsley. The result? Charred edges, smoky aroma, and meat that was surprisingly soft and rich. This wasn't an everyday meal. Octopus was special, often saved for feast days, weddings, or big family gatherings. For immigrant families scraping by in the mills, bringing octopus to the table meant pride, proof that tradition could survive across an ocean. Kids might wrinkle their noses at first, but one bite of smoky, garlicky tentacle turned hesitation into loyalty. Here's the kicker. Even now, Fall River's Portuguese restaurants showcase polvo grelhado as a centerpiece dish. It's not just food, it's living heritage on a plate. 9. Ajo de tamboril com gambas. If there was one dish that made simple rice feel like luxury, it was aho de tamboril com gambas, monkfish and shrimp rice. Monkfish, often called poor man's lobster, had firm, sweet meat that held up perfectly in a simmering pot. Add shrimp, garlic, onions, and a slow-cooked tomato broth, and suddenly a humble grain became the centerpiece of a feast. In early 1900s, Fall River, this dish was a reminder of the sea. Many immigrants had fished those waters back in Portugal, and now they found new abundance off the New England coast. A pot of monkfish rice stretched to feed a big family, yet still felt special enough for Sundays. Children loved digging for the shrimp, while parents savored the rich broth soaked deep into every spoonful of rice. Here's the kicker. This dish blurred the line between everyday comfort and ocean-born luxury. Exactly what Portuguese families needed to feel both grounded and proud. 10. Moelas. Nothing went to waste in a Portuguese kitchen, and moelas proved it. Chicken gizzards, often overlooked or tossed aside in American homes, became the star of a rich, hearty stew. Slowly simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and sometimes white beans, the gizzards turned tender, soaking up every layer of flavor until the whole pot smelled like comfort. In Fall River's early 1900s tenements, moelas was a working man's dish. Poultry scraps were cheap, beans stretched the pot, and long simmering turned tough cuts into something warm and filling. Families gathered around steaming bowls, tearing off bread to mop up the thick sauce, proving that thrift and taste could live side by side. Here's the kicker. Moelas wasn't just resourceful, it was beloved. What outsiders saw as leftovers, Portuguese families saw as tradition. Even today, you'll find moelas bubbling in taverns across Fall River, a humble dish that never lost its place on the table. 11. Caldo verde. If one dish could be called the heartbeat of Portuguese homes in Fall River, it was caldo verde. This green soup was humble in ingredients but rich in comfort. Potatoes mashed into a silky broth, ribbons of dark kale floating through, and a few slices of smoky linguiça giving it body and soul. For mill workers trudging home in the biting New England cold, a bowl of caldo verde was like a blanket from the inside out. It was cheap, nourishing, and stretched easily. A single pot could feed a family and still leave enough for tomorrow's lunch. Mothers often served it with nothing more than crusty bread, and that was enough to keep everyone satisfied. Here's the kicker. Caldo verde wasn't just food, it was memory. Every sip tied families back to their villages in Portugal. Even today, no Fall River feast or festival feels complete without this timeless, heartwarming soup. 12. Carne de vinhadalhos. Before it inspired Puerto Rico's pernil and even the Christmas flavors of Hawaii, carne de vinhadalhos was already the pride of Portuguese kitchens in Fall River. Chunks of pork were bathed overnight in garlic, vinegar, and wine, then slow-cooked until tender, tangy, and bursting with flavor. The marinade not only seasoned the meat, but preserved it, a practical trick in tenement kitchens without refrigeration. For working families, this dish was a treat often saved for Sundays or holidays. The smell of garlic and wine filled entire stairwells, and neighbors knew exactly which apartment had a pot of vinhadalhos bubbling on the stove. Served with crusty bread or boiled potatoes, it was rustic, filling, and impossible to resist. Here's the kicker. What started as a thrifty preservation method became a celebration dish. In Fall River, it tied families together, and today it still shows up at festivals, a living link between survival cooking and joyous tradition. 13. Ajo de pato. When Portuguese families in Fall River wanted to impress, they turned to ajo de pato, duck rice. Picture tender duck meat simmered until falling off the bone, shredded into fragrant rice cooked with onions, garlic, and broth, then baked in the oven with slices of smoky chorizo laid across the top. The smell alone could pull neighbors to the door. This wasn't an everyday meal. Duck was expensive and usually reserved for special occasions, weddings, baptisms, or Sunday feasts when the whole family gathered. But when it appeared, it transformed the table into something grand. The richness of the duck, the spice of chorizo, and the golden crust of baked rice made every bite feel like celebration. Here's the kicker. Ajo de pato carried more than flavor. It carried pride. For immigrants who worked long hours in the mills, serving duck rice was proof that tradition and dignity could survive in a new world. 14. Ardosia de peixe. In early 1900s, Fall River, Fridays often meant fish, and nothing captured that tradition better than ardosia de peixe, a simple fish platter. Seasonal catches like cod, hake, or mackerel were boiled or lightly grilled, then served alongside soft potatoes and a heap of fresh greens. A drizzle of olive oil, maybe a squeeze of lemon, tied it all together. For Portuguese immigrant families, this dish was as much about faith as it was about food. The Catholic tradition of meatless Fridays kept fish at the center of the table, and Fall River's waterfront made fresh catches easy to find. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, healthy, and carried the clean flavors of home. Kids might have wished for sausages, but parents knew this plate kept bodies strong and traditions alive. Here's the kicker. Even in its simplicity, the fish platter carried weight. It reminded families that sometimes the purest meals were also the most enduring. 15. Tripas à moda de Porto. If there was ever a dish that proved nothing went to waste, it was tripas à moda de Porto. Brought from northern Portugal, this hearty stew took cow tripe, a cut many others tossed aside, and transformed it into a rich, flavorful meal. Slowly simmered with onions, carrots, and white beans, the tripe absorbed every spice, turning tender in a broth, deepened with chorizo or bacon. In Fall River's early Portuguese kitchens, this dish was a test of both patience and pride. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling and cheap, perfect for families with many mouths and little money. The story went that Porto gave its best meats to sailors, leaving the people with tripe, and they made it legendary. Immigrants carried that same resilience to America. Here's the kicker. Tripas wasn't just stew, it was a badge of identity. Serving it in Fall River meant honoring roots, even when times were tough. Even today, you'll still find tripas simmering in church kitchens and family homes during festivals, carrying the same pride across generations. One spoonful tells you this dish wasn't just built to last, it was built to remember. 16. Feijoada portuguesa. If one dish could be called the king of comfort food, it was feijoada portuguesa. This bean and pork stew wasn't just dinner, it was an event. Picture a heavy pot bubbling away on a wood stove, filled with red or white beans, chunks of pork, smoky chorizo, and maybe a bit of salted bacon. Carrots, onions, and cabbage stretched the stew, turning scraps into something hearty enough to feed a crowd. In Fall River's tenement kitchens, feijoada was the perfect solution for big families and small paychecks. It cooked slow, it cooked long, and it turned the cheapest cuts into something rich and satisfying. Served with rice or boiled potatoes, one pot could feed neighbors as well as kin. Here's the kicker. Feijoada was never just food, it was fellowship. Ladled into bowls at festivals and Sunday dinners, it carried the warmth of community. Even today, Fall River tables still echo with that same spirit. It was the kind of meal that filled not just stomachs, but hearts, binding families together after long mill shifts. One taste of feijoada reminded every immigrant that even in a new land, home could still be shared around the table. 17. Massa sovada. Few smells could rival the magic of massa sovada rising in a Fall River kitchen. This Azorean sweet bread, rich with eggs, sugar, and butter, was kneaded by hand and baked into golden loaves that perfumed the whole tenement. Families sliced it warm, slathering it with butter or homemade jam, turning a simple breakfast into a celebration. Massa sovada wasn't just everyday bread, it carried deep meaning. Traditionally baked for Easter and special festivals, it symbolized abundance and blessing even when life in the mills felt scarce. Children loved its soft, pillowy texture, while adults tasted memory in every bite. And when neighbors gathered, a loaf on the table was as much a gesture of hospitality as it was food. Here's the kicker. Massa sovada survived every generation. Walk into a Fall River bakery today, and you'll still find it cooling on racks, ready to carry the same comfort that lifted immigrant families over a century ago. It wasn't unusual for families to trade loaves with neighbors, each one slightly different, but all carrying the same spirit of giving. At church feasts, long tables lined with massa sovada reminded everyone that abundance could be shared even in lean times. To this day, the first bite of its sweet, fluffy crumb feels like stepping back into a grandmother's kitchen, where love was always baked into the bread. 18. Pastéis de nata. If there was one dessert that felt like a true taste of Lisbon brought to Fall River, it was the pastéis de nata. Imagine a flaky pastry shell, baked golden and crisp, cradling a silky custard filling kissed with vanilla, lemon, and just a hint of cinnamon. Served warm, often dusted with powdered sugar, these tarts melted in your mouth while leaving just enough sweetness to make you reach for another. In the early 1900s, Portuguese bakeries in Fall River became community hubs, and pastéis de nata were their crown jewels. Immigrant families stopped in after church, children pressing noses to glass cases while parents splurged on a small box. A few pennies bought a moment of luxury, a bite of home thousands of miles away. Here's the kicker. More than a century later, those same tarts remain bestsellers. Every bite still carries the story of resilience, faith, and the simple joy of sweetness shared after hard days in the mills. 19. Peixinhos da horta. Leave it to the Portuguese to turn something as humble as green beans into a dish worth celebrating. Peixinhos da horta, which literally means little fishes from the garden, took fresh green beans, dipped them in a light batter, and fried them until crisp and golden. Paired with a drizzle of garlic sauce, they looked like tiny fried fish, crunchy on the outside, tender on the inside, and bursting with flavor. In early 1900s, Fall River, this was a common snack in Portuguese households. Green beans were cheap and easy to grow in backyard gardens, making them a perfect choice for large families. Fried food brought comfort after long mill shifts, and kids devoured these crispy bites by the handful. Here's the kicker. This simple dish actually inspired Japan's tempura centuries earlier through Portuguese traders. And yet in Fall River, it stayed close to its roots, proof that even the humblest vegetables can carry a story across oceans. 20. Arroz de marisco with chouriço. If seafood rice was already beloved, adding smoky sausage turned it into something unforgettable. Arroz de marisco with chouriço blended the richness of shellfish, clams, mussels, shrimp, with the deep, savory punch of Portuguese sausage. The rice soaked it all up, creating a dish that was both elegant and hearty, ocean and smoke in the same pot. In early 1900s, Fall River, this dish often appeared at community gatherings. Fishermen brought in their catch, but it was the chouriço, hanging from kitchen rafters or sold in neighborhood shops, that gave the rice its distinct flavor. Families piled around big pots, scooping generous servings into bowls, the orange-red broth staining spoons and smiles alike. 21. Polvo a lagareiro. If grilling octopus was festive, baking it took things to another level. Polvo a lagareiro was a dish that Portuguese families in Fall River saved for true celebrations. The octopus was first boiled until tender, then roasted in a hot oven alongside small potatoes, all drenched in olive oil and garlic. The heat crisped the edges while keeping the inside buttery soft, creating a meal that was both rustic and refined. For immigrant households, this dish carried prestige. Octopus wasn't cheap, so it usually appeared at weddings, feast days, or holiday tables when extended families gathered shoulder to shoulder. The aroma of garlic and oil filling the room marked the occasion as special. Children remembered it as the big dish, the one that made the whole house pause. Here's the kicker. Polvo a lagareiro became a signature of Portuguese pride. In Fall River, it wasn't just octopus. It was a symbol that even far from the Azores, tradition could shine. 22. Caldeirada de peixe. If there was one dish that tasted like the ocean itself, It was caldeirada de peixe. This Portuguese fish stew was built around whatever the sea and season offered: cod, haddock, mackerel, or even eel, simmered slowly with onions, tomatoes, potatoes, and carrots. A drizzle of olive oil and a touch of paprika brought it all together, filling kitchens with the smell of both sea and hearth. In early 1900s, Fall River, caldeirada was a fisherman's gift. Families with ties to the docks often brought home baskets of odd cuts or small fish too humble for market. Nothing went to waste. Everything went into the pot. The result was a meal that fed large families cheaply, yet still carried the richness of tradition. Here's the kicker. Caldeirada wasn't just sustenance. It was memory. For immigrants staring at the Taunton River, every spoonful recalled coastal villages back in Portugal, reminding them they were never far from home. 23. Cabrito assado. When Portuguese families in Fall River truly wanted to mark a special occasion, they turned to cabrito assado, roast goat. Marinated with garlic, wine, olive oil, and fresh herbs, the goat was slow roasted until the meat was tender and fragrant, the skin crisped and golden. The aroma filled entire neighborhoods, signaling a feast was near. Goat wasn't an everyday meat in early 1900s America, but for immigrants from the Azores and mainland Portugal, it was tradition. Cabrito often appeared at Easter, weddings, and Holy Ghost festivals, bringing families and neighbors together around one table. Potatoes roasted in the same pan soaked up the juices, making every bite rich and celebratory. Here's the kicker. Serving roast goat wasn't just about food, it was about identity. For Portuguese immigrants working grueling mill jobs, cabrito was proof that no matter how hard life became, they could still honor their heritage with flavors too powerful to fade. 24. Ajo dolce. If there was one dessert that felt like a warm embrace, it was ajo dolce, Portuguese rice pudding. Simmered slowly with milk, sugar, and short-grain rice, it was flavored with lemon zest and crowned with a dusting of cinnamon, often arranged in little lattice patterns on top. Sweet, creamy, and comforting, it was the kind of dish that made a crowded tenement feel like home. For immigrant families in Fall River, ajo dolce was more than just dessert. It was a dish of love, often prepared for baptisms, birthdays, and holidays, when mothers and grandmothers passed wooden spoons from hand to hand. Children scraped the pot for the last bits, while guests always left with a small bowl wrapped in kindness. Here's the kicker. Ajo dolce wasn't flashy, but it carried memory in every spoonful. Even today, no Portuguese table in Fall River feels complete without it, proof that sweetness is sometimes the strongest tie to the past. 25. Doce de ovos e folhares. No celebration in Fall River's Portuguese community felt complete without sweets tied to faith. Doce de ovos, rich little cakes made from egg yolks and sugar, symbolized indulgence and blessing. Golden, delicate, and almost glowing, they were the kind of treat reserved for feast days and weddings when tables groaned under the weight of family and tradition. Alongside them came folhares, festival breads baked especially for the Holy Ghost celebrations. Sweet yeasted loaves often wrapped around a hard-boiled egg, they carried deep symbolism, rebirth, community, and faith carried through food. In the early 1900s, women baked them in crowded kitchens, sending the smell of warm bread drifting down entire blocks. Here's the kicker. These weren't just recipes, they were rituals. Every bite of doce de ovos or slice of folar tied Fall River families back to Portugal, turning faith into flavor. A century later, they're still baked for festivals, living proof that heritage never dies when it's shared at the table. When you